Well, welcome back to our journey through the Bible in 2025 together. And this week we're going to cover Genesis 42 to Exodus chapter 11. We're also going to do our daily psalm and proverb together. And in our reading this week, we're going to unpack some of the most dramatic and pivotal moments in Israel's history here. We're going to cover things like Joseph's emotional reunion, and I mean emotional reunion with his family, their settlement in Egypt, all the way to Moses' calling, the powerful display of God's authority through the 10 plagues over Egypt. And these chapters are rich with meaning for us today. I'm hoping and praying that as you read, you pick up a lot of the things that God wants to speak and encourage you in. So let's dive into some of these highlights a little bit more, along with some key themes, and really unpack, as we have been, the supernatural perspective and worldview that ties all these things together. And also, if you would, don't forget, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments here. Email me. I'd love to address them, answer them, even get them in the Q&A videos coming up here. So here's some overview of the major highlights of what I just briefly went over before. First and foremost, we see Israel, their settlement in Egypt, because there's a reunion that takes place with Joseph. And after these years of separation and suffering, finally, he reveals himself, his identity to his brothers, forgives them despite their betrayal. And this really speaks to his deep faith and trust in God's sovereignty. It's evident as he declares, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." What a powerful understanding of how God works. So by inviting his family to settle in Egypt, Joseph preserves Israel during this severe famine that's taking place. But this also foreshadows their eventual enslavement in Egypt. And this event marks a very pivotal moment in Israel's history where God's provision and his long-term plans for his chosen people start to become evident along the way. Then we get into the oppression of Israel and God's call to Moses. So as Israel, the nation, grows in numbers, Pharaoh is threatened by their size, and so he imposes this brutal slavery on them. Yet even in this suffering, God, he's not silent. He hears their cries, and he begins to prepare a deliverer. This is Moses. And so through the miraculous encounter that we're going to read about the burning bush, God reveals his name. I am who I am. And this emphasizes his eternal presence, his unchanging nature. It's beautiful. So Moses, he's a bit reluctant. Of course, we're going to read that. He's full of doubt. But God assures him of his power, God's power, his promise. And it's a reminder that God often requires our trust beyond our own abilities in this. So then we lead to the 10 plagues coming upon Egypt. And this is God's judgment through the 10 plagues, not only confronting Pharaoh, but God systematically dismantles the false gods of Egypt. So from turning the Nile to blood to the death of the firstborn, each plague targets specific deities in Egypt, proving their powerlessness. So in that, here's 3 key themes that I think we need to pay attention to and be sure that we're focusing on as we're reading throughout this week. Number 1, God's ultimate plan is always in place. Let me repeat that. God's ultimate plan is always in place. So the journey of Israel settling in Egypt and eventually becoming enslaved was not outside of God's plan. It may seem like that's odd, but it was not outside of his plan. Before they could inherit the promised land, they needed to endure this oppression here and experience God's deliverance, his faithfulness in this. And this really shapes their identity as his people. And this process will remind us that God often has challenges, I could say, that we need to be prepared to face in his timeline, and these are to refine and prepare us for God's greater purpose in our life. Number two here, God chooses the unlikely to fulfill his plans. Moses, a man who actually fled Egypt as a fugitive, doubted his own abilities here, is called by God to lead the entire nation to freedom. And this is going to show that God often chooses individuals that we might overlook or disqualify ourselves. And it emphasizes his power working through humanity's weakness. Moses' story should really encourage us to say yes to God, his call for our life, trusting that it's his strength that is perfect. It's made perfect in our limitations, our weaknesses, as Paul would talk about. And finally, number three, God uses everything for our good. Somebody needs to hear that. God uses everything for our good. So from Joseph's unique suffering all throughout his life here to Moses, his upbringing in Israel, the household there, God orchestrates these details along the way to prepare eventually for Israel's deliverance. We see the position in Egypt that is ensuring Israel's survival during a famine, all the way to Moses' familiarity with the culture in Egypt. I mean, God is really setting things in place to work for their good. So even when we don't see it, God is weaving all of these things to bring himself glory, to work it out for our ultimate good. And so we can cling to that promise in our life. And lastly, I want to add some supernatural worldview commentary to what's going on behind the scenes, so to speak, here, because there's a lot that takes place in the supernatural. The 10 plagues were more than physical judgments. They are a direct assault on the gods of Egypt, like I said before, exposing their powerlessness. And each plague corresponds to an aspect of Egyptian worship, from the Nile god of Happy to Ra, the sun god. All of them are attached to a deity that they worshiped. And this connects us back to the Tower of Babel, Deuteronomy 32:8, where God disinherits the nations and allows spiritual beings called sons of God, who Paul describes in the New Testament as principalities and cosmic powers, to govern all the nations. So Egypt, like other nations, was under these spiritual rulers, but God demonstrates his sovereignty over all these spiritual powers, reclaiming his people for himself. So this week's reading really reminds us that God is not just the creator, but also the ultimate ruler of all of his creation, spiritual and physical. He is above all powers. He is fulfilling his plans all the time, and he is protecting his people. So as I end here and we reflect on these chapters that we're going to be reading, let's remember God's ultimate plan is always at work, how he often uses unlikely people to accomplish his will, and how he turns every situation for good. And I really hope this encourages you this week as you're reading along. And again, if you have any questions, comments, put them in the comment section here. Email me. We'll go through them together. Be sure to check out any additional study materials on the website here. And we'll catch you next week as well as we continue through the Bible in a year.